everyone, welcome to another Thursday Tips and Tricks. We're going to wrap up our lesson on binding as I show you how to do the hand stitches and share with you some of the hints and tips that I've learned having bound literally hundreds of quilts in my lifetime. First thing you're going to want to gather up your equipment that you need. You will need some hand stitching needles. They can either be Milners or Sharps, or there are actually some binding needles out there. They should be a little bit longer and a little bit stronger than an applique needle. You're going to want to have thread in colors that match your binding. It may not match your backing, but it has to match your binding. You may or may not decide you want to use thimbles. If I have a lot of binding to do and my finger gets sore, I'll put one on. But generally, I bind without the thimbles. And there are these wonder clips that some people use when they're doing their binding. Again, I tend not to use them, but they're there if that's something that you need. And then once you have all of that equipment pulled together, the next thing to do is to start the process. Now, I've got a couple of projects here at various stages because, as you recall, Sarah and I talked about doing binding differently. I used the tuck method and she used the invisible method. And, I used her method this week, loved it. So, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. But I'm going to show you the tuck method that I used, and I demonstrated this a couple of weeks ago, and how you go ahead and start that. So, one of the things that I didn't do for this demonstration. I said that the thread should match the binding, and that's true. But if I do that, you're not going to be able to see this at all. So here's the tuck method, where I put the fold in at the beginning, and I have just the end of the binding when I walked around, cut it at an angle, and I'm going to tuck that into that little pocket that's made when I added the binding with my machine. Now, the fold that's right there is open, and I need to stitch that closed. And to do that, I'm just going to put a knot in my thread, and I'm using white thread so that you can see the stitching. But here's my favorite knot. I do this by pointing my needle up north, take my thread and have it pointing the end of the thread down in the other direction, and wrap 3 times around the needle. Grab both the threads and pull the needle through the knot. It makes a beautiful little starting knot, and that's one of my favorite knots for doing this type of work. When I do this, close up that fold, what I'm going to do is come through the back, so the knot will be buried into the fold. And I'm going to take what's called a tack stitch. It's a little tiny stitch that comes from the fold over into the other part of the binding, and then come back up, travel underneath, and come back up in the fold. So that all you're going to see is a little tiny thread. And if I pull real tight, that thread almost disappears, even though it's completely the wrong color thread for this project. So again, I'm trying to come straight across over the fold, give it a pull, and it just kind of disappears into the binding, up in the fold, and work your way across. Then I would keep those stitches fairly close as I'm closing up that end to the binding. When I get to the very end of that folded edge, I'll throw in a couple of stitches down here and throw in a knot, and then start working on the binding in earnest, going all the way around. Now, when you do that, when you have that edge sealed up, so it's all together, and you're wrapping the binding around to the back, there are 2 decisions you have to make here. Working from the back, you have to decide whether you're going to travel clockwise around your project or whether you're going to travel counterclockwise around your project. If you travel clockwise, what's going to happen is the fold is kind of away from you, and your project is on the table in front of you, and you're going to do your stitching right-handed going in this direction. But you can also go in the opposite direction, which enables you to look at the edge of the fold on the binding when you're traveling around. But what that results in is all the bulk of the quilt being in your lap. So it's a choice whether you're going to go clockwise or counterclockwise, whether you want to have the bulk of the quilt on the table or whether you want to have the bulk of the quilt in your lap. That may depend on the temperature that you're doing. But once you bring that around, I'm going to add a quick back tack there, maybe throw in a little bit of a knot. To do the stitching, it's the same situation where you're traveling between the layers, coming up in the fold of the binding, and moving straight across. Don't be moving forward or moving backward with the needle. I'm going to reinsert the needle, travel between the layers, and come up in the fold. And these stitches, yeah, you want to make them kind of regular, but one of the things you want to make sure when you're working along that you're keeping a finger underneath there to make sure that you're not getting any traveling stitches showing on the front of your project. If you do, unthread your needle and come back, take that out, because that's very distracting, and especially if you're going to put a quilt in a show, you want to make sure not to have any of those traveling stitches. So it's a process that can be moved right along. I usually take about 20 to 30 stitches, and then I'll throw a knot in by just coming down and up in the same spot, making a little loop, putting a knot in it. That way, if the binding does decide to come apart, I don't have to redo the whole binding. It's just going to go from knot to knot. All right, so that's how we're going to do the straight edge. But remember last week, what Sarah and I both did was put the fold of the binding so that we had a corner that looked like this. And let me get rid of that little bit of thread there. We had the fold already in there. What I do with mine, and I'm going to show you the stitching on another one. One of the reasons that I do not do the stitching, Sarah, when she did her fold, and you can watch this from last week, did a line of stitching out there in the binding. She's not able to do that, but that binding tends to anchor that corner very tightly there. What I like to do is come back with my scissors and snip away the corner. So I'm only snipping the binding. I'm leaving the base of the quilt in play, but that is removing a lot of the bulk so that when I go to wrap this around, it doesn't become very bulky. Now, I've got myself near a corner. Let me see if I can find it here so that I can show you how I actually do that folding. I'm going to put this underneath here so it holds it in place. So I need to go, so this corner has already been snipped, and I'm going to work this way, and I'm going to do my hand stitching all the way up to the machine stitching that holds the binding on, going on the opposite corner right there. So I'm going to just put one or two more stitches in here to complete this corner. There's one more. When I get to that line of stitching, that's right here is that line of stitching, I'm going to put a knot to anchor and hold the corner tight so that I can do the next part of the operation. And what I'm going to do here, you can see how we have the fold coming out in this direction. The point of that fold, but where this 45 and this meet is going to be folded back and right to that point that I've just stitched. So let me hold that down. I know it's a little challenging to see, but I'm going to take that, fold it right back in there, and make that fold. The fold is now right there, and that's going to give me a mitered corner on both the front and the back. So let me do that one more time. I'm going to put this underneath here so it holds it a little bit for me. Fold that over, and right at that corner, pick it up, do several more stitches to really anchor that down. And then once I've got it anchored, I'm ready to wrap that binding around and keep on stitching in that direction. And I have a nice mitered corner here and a nice mitered corner there. You may decide to come back and stitch that tight if you'd like, but you don't have to. That's a personal preference on that. And so, you know, there's one other hint that I do a couple other hints that I do. One of the things is when I travel, I'm often in a car, or I'm, sitting with a very big quilt on my lap. One of the things is I work with scissors and a needle nanny, so that I always have scissors where they need to be. It makes it very quick and easy to anchor those. And the other thing that I do is I make myself a little thread caddy. It's a piece of cotton twine through my thread with a safety pin at the end. And I clip that to my quilt as I'm going. And that way I've always got my thread handy. I'm not losing it. I can pull off what I need, give it a snip, and I'm ready to go with my binding chore. Now, some of you might not like to do binding, but if you're not a fan of binding, find yourself a comfortable place, get yourself a nice, cozy something to drink, whether it's wine or a cup of hot coffee, and try to be at peace with it. This is the last time you're going to be visiting this quilt, and hopefully you're going to be enjoying your binding, so that you can actually have your quilts finished and able to be used. So hope that helps everybody. Take care. Have a great week. We'll see you next Thursday.